Have you seen War of the Rohirrim?
All Middle-earth knows the tale of the War of the Ring. But 200 years before that...
Riders of the Mark! Brothers of Rohan!
What happens when an honorable duel ends with bloodthirsty vow of vengeance? Well, our hero finds out when vengeance returns 4 years later, devastates his kingdom and kills his heirs. Our king slowly begins to fall into... What do you mean this movie isn't about Helm Hammerhand? It's about the princess, Hera. She wasn't even given a name in Tolkien's appendix. Why her? I don't understand. So, does Wulf return because he wants vengeance on Helm Hammerhand or Hera? That's stupid. Why don't we just tell what Tolkien wrote? That's not the only change? What else did they change? Oh my god. This movie bombed, didn't it? Oh. I have a headache now. I guess let's start this again. What happens when a group of friends coast on something they made 20 years ago? Well, Big Daddy WBD lets them make any story they wish to tell, even if there's a clear and obvious sign that it will fail. From the screenplay written by Philippa Boyan's daughter comes a forgettable movie with odd animation choices and a story that will leave you fighting narcolepsy. Now, you may be saying that I'm being mean to this movie, which I would say, then you haven't watched it. This movie somehow makes Middle-earth forgettable, or worse, it fills you with the will to never return again. And some of the big reasons for that is because of how far they got away from Tolkien's work. The same folly they committed to with the Hobbit movies is the same issue as this movie. The more they added and changed to the Hobbit, the worse the movies became, and that's not even talking about the CGI. So when you read the 1,300 or so words written about Helm Hammerhand and his nephew's successor, Freyalef, it's more descriptive and imaginative than this whole movie. Now, I won't say that this movie didn't have any imaginative moments. I mean, there was at least one moment with the siege tower. And that's it. The movie is 2 hours long, and I don't feel anything about anyone, nor do I care about the events happening. I just have an overwhelming desire to yawn. So, in order for me to give this movie a review without being overly prejudiced against it, I'm going to separate it from Tolkien's work and focus just on the movie without any of Tolkien's lore or the history of Rohan, pre and post. Now, I'll be honest, it doesn't fix the movie. Also, one minor change, before I forget, that we need to do before jumping into this is changing the title of the movie. I don't have a problem with War of the Rohirrim. I have more of a problem with Lord of the Rings. These 3 books are Lord of the Rings. The prequel, The Hobbit, isn't Lord of the Rings. It's The Hobbit, or it's There and Back Again. If anything, I would have named this movie Middle-earth, War of the Rohirrim, or Middle-earth Stories, or Tales of Middle-earth. Just something along those lines, because I hate how everyone, including Amazon, is riding the coattails of 3 successful movies from 20 years ago. So now that we've covered changing the title and talking about how we're going to try to remove the prefix of Tolkien when we're talking about Tolkien's work, we're now going to jump into things, and we're going to talk about the background or the making of the movie, the writing or the writers, director, casting, and the plot. Our first topic is making of this movie, where we will also tie a little bit into the writers and the director of this snooze fest, while sharing tidbits of backstory that I didn't thoroughly research. So, the making of this movie. The only reason that this movie was made was to prevent New Line from losing the movie rights. That's it. No other reason. They didn't even have an idea in place, just that they didn't want to lose the rights. The idea of this movie began in 2021, which when you think about when this movie came out, makes you realize the short window they gave themselves to come up with the idea, write the script, find a cast, and animate the whole movie. And because of that, you can see that this wasn't given the proper time to really polish itself. Director Kenji Kamiyama, or however you say his name, who they call legendary in their trailers, which I've never heard of him, was brought in alongside producer Joseph Chu after working on WBD's Blade Runner Black Lotus. Now, this is the first project that I have ever seen by Kamiyama, and after looking up his IMDb movies and their scores, he's a middle of the road director. Usually his projects won't fall below 5, which is when movies are really bad and subpar that the general audiences can enjoy, but could develop a cult following. Nor has his movies gone over a 7, and that's where movies begin to fall into, admiration and wide appeal mainstream. So, he's just an average director. Also, when looking at his history, he also has been the main writer on many of his projects, and that's actually how he got his big break in Tokyo Wood, and I don't know why. Because he doesn't elevate movies or TV shows, and many of his projects aren't good, especially his recent projects with the Ghost in the Shell franchise. Which brings me to another issue that I have with WBD choices and director. Kamiyama has worked on numerous projects, and many of those projects have been futuristic. And the ones that aren't are either in some dystopian future, i.e. still technically futuristic, or are in modern day Japan. Now, going out to find a director that has made only medieval movies isn't really going to change the movie, nor is the director that hasn't worked on medieval projects bound to fail at making a sword and sorcery movie. But when you're WBD and you have many recent projects under your belt that include hack and slash, then why wouldn't you just tap someone like Genndy Tartakovsky? And for you who are wondering who Genndy Tartakovsky is, and that's really hard to say, he just recently created the TV series Primal on Cartoon Network or Adult Swim, which is owned by WBD. Anyways, he also has an extensive history with hack and slash and War Department movies with makings of TV shows like Samurai Jack and Star Wars Clone Wars, the original ones underneath George Lucas. And if not him, WBD could have easily contacted the numerous Japanese artists and directors that have worked on their recent project. Now, to reiterate, this would not have changed the script of the movie. I mean, maybe. It depends really if Tartakovsky or whoever outside of Kamiyama would be braver in pushing back against Boyens and the other producers or not. But the animation choices could have led to a more graphically pleasing movie, or at least more pleasing than Kamiyama's choices in animation style, since his choices was using motion capture with the actors and then drawing in the backgrounds. The biggest issue with this movie was that all the characters looked like they were standing on top of grass or in front of a massive portrait. There were big chunks of the movie where the background looks like some of those backgrounds that you see in JRPGs when you talk to an NPC. The background is either a stiff portrait or has slight animation of movement. It works a little better near the end of the movie when everything is more enclosed and smaller scale, or maybe I just got used to it by then. Now that I've gotten a little sidetracked with Kamiyama's animation taste, I still think a better director could have allowed for a better story to be told if they push back against the writing and the producers, which leads us into our next topic, writing. So let's talk a little bit about the writing team. And remember, based on our timeline, all these people were brought in 2021. At this time, Boyens is nothing more than a consultant. Joseph Chu is the only producer, and there's probably still numerous executive producers. And Kamiyama is the director. And if you're wondering what an executive producer does, they don't really do anything. They're there for consulting and bouncing ideas off of, but mainly they're just there to get their names on some movies and pad their resumes. So starting in 2020 to 2021, WBD hired Jeffrey Adidas and Will Matthews to write the script, which the movie does give them credit. These guys don't have a super extensive history, but did write a highly acclaimed show in 2019, just not one that was very watched. And that was Netflix's The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance. Now, I haven't seen it. I saw it numerous times on Netflix's home screen and never clicked. But when the critics and the fans have the same rating for a show, usually it means it's either really good, really bad, but both sides have the same consensus. But something happened in 2021 during the lockdowns. Now, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but all I'm going to say is that during the lockdowns, Boyens was elevated to producer, Adidas and Matthews were dismissed, and Boyens had her daughter, Phoebe Gittins, and her daughter's writing partner, Artie Papagiorgio, take over and change the script. Probably, maybe not extensively, but just enough in order to be given a writer's credit, which means they had to change at least 33% of the script. So at least a third of this movie can be claimed by Gittins and Papa Giorgio. And technically, they could have actually rewritten the whole movie, and Adidas and Matthews, I believe, would still be given credit for the story and basing their script off, someone else's. But either way, take with that what you will. But according to, other producers and the director and Boyan's nepotism at play, with this writing team taking over the script, they were able to explore a more darker, more horrific impacts of war than having just large-scale battles. If only they actually had those things. But Kamiyami did get to include one thing in the movie, and that was the Siege of Helm's Deep and the Siege Tower. One of the only neat moments of the whole movie that didn't make any sense in the long run. Now, while you sit there and mull over if nepotism was at play or not, let's move over to the cast now. Or should I say cast member? Because the only reason I watched this, and probably for many of you, is Brian Cox. Now, I'm not going to say he was a bad choice for this role, but I can't say he was great. This was off the tail end of his stellar performance on Succession, where he yelled and cussed and showed love and aggravation. He just showed real talent and volume in his performance. Seeing him in that, you realize not only is he a highly acclaimed, multi-awarded actor, but you knew why WBD linked him to do this role as well.
Hello? Aren't you a pretty thing? Fancy a roll in the hay?
His name alone could have filled theaters upon theaters with moviegoers. But then the trailer dropped, and more information about the movie was released, and no one could care less. And you know what the worst thing about the hiring of Brian Cox was? We didn't get any of what he showed on Succession. Instead of a performance on par with like a lion as it slowly cornered, we were instead given an average voice acting performance where any Tom, Dick, or Harry could have easily did the same thing. They could have just cast any of the Mr. Fantastics and they would have given a same or maybe a less or a little greater than performance. You just kind of leave feeling robbed that, so much hype was put into it and he wasn't even there really for it. And all I could think is, who could have taken this, very script and elevated it, or at least given a performance that would be noteworthy? Clancy Brown, right off the top of my head. I didn't even have to really think about it. Who, by the way, also has a long history with voice acting.
My spies tell me that Hamilton has a piece of my rock.
What? Profit's down $3 from last month. I gotta start running a tighter ship around here.
My name is General Krieg. You've survived your first true battle and proven yourself worthy of your Viltrumite heritage.
Unlike Brian Cox. And if you're wondering about everyone else, they're fine. They're there. Everyone is kind of held back by the script. Now, we're finally about to start talking about the plot. And like I said before, I have to remove Tolkien from my mind the best as I can, which even with his removal, this movie is subpar. But when you remind yourself that it's based on Tolkien's work, it's a solid 0 out of 10. Because the amount of liberties that they take with this movie taints the whole project. Also, beforehand, I really want to try to review this movie without falling into the regular Rey tropes and calling Hera a Mary Sue, and actually give you an in-depth review. But it must be mentioned that Hera starts off normalish, and by the end we've left the realm of common sense. But both female characters are like this, while the movie seems to really not try to give any glory to the male characters, unless they're about to kill them off. So let's get started, and no, I won't do a scene by scene, because that would just take too long, but just highlight where a lot of the story got muddled and fell off in some, quick and easy points. Point 1, had the villain focus more on Hera than vengeance. So early in the movie, it's established that our villain Wulf and our heroine Hera not only knew each other, but also that she gave Wulf his scar and he's been in love with her ever since childhood. All very anime-ish storytelling. But the whole entire plot of this movie should have been about Wulf wishing to get vengeance on Helm for killing his father. But several times throughout the movie, Wulf shifts his focus solely on getting Hera, killing her or torturing her, That his grievance isn't the death of his father, but the rejection of his marriage proposal to Hera.
Don't you understand? This is all I have. Without vengeance, this will have been for nothing. No, we cannot show weakness. Not to her. This keep will be her tomb.
It takes away from the film, and it's constantly focusing on her instead of her father, which actually ties into another one of my points that I'll cover further in. But one of the big issues for focusing on Hera more than Helm was because they rewrote Helm and Freka's fight. Helm and Freka, who is a Dunlending who serves Helm, they have an honorable duel in the movie that ends with the latter's death. In the appendix, Helm bullies Freka and basically beats him to death without any audience, making Wulf truly believe that his father was killed, not honorably, but like a dog. And Helm also proceeds to banish Wulf and his clan and make them outlaws. So Wulf has a lot of reasons for wanting to kill Helm in the appendix. And the appendix, though, goes on to show us that Helm is not a good man. But if you get rid of that, your want for vengeance for an honorable duel where your father threw first doesn't make any sense. But the fact that the whole movie devolved from that into a bad guy wanting to claim or harm the heroine, it just felt very, Star Wars-y sequel-y to me. Like everything has to be about these particular two people. Number 2, Helm Hammerhand was a minor character in a movie that was supposed to be about him because it's based on his entry in the appendix. So just imagine if Lord of the Rings had Frodo and Aragorn, but when they made the movie, it was about Bilbo's final days with the elves. Or it was about Gimli's cousin Trimley, and it was mainly about beard styling, with some cutaways to the Fellowship as they're trying to destroy the ring. You would become furious about this, which is what happened, and that's why the movie didn't make any money. At the same time, Hera wasn't an interesting character, nor was her story, and Helm was so underwritten that you couldn't even do a narrative shift if you wanted to. To compare it to the appendix's narrative, the movie should have been about grief and loss for Helm Hammerhand for his bullying and the murder of Freka. The repercussions of his actions was the death of his sons and the destruction of his kingdom. That he spent the last days of his life in agony and torment, killing men in a bloody fisted rage while his people starved and froze to death around him. And we got very little of that. Also, for some odd reason, the movie decided to incorporate Dunlending propaganda.
A terrible unholy sight. Eyes that burn like coals as he feasts on the flesh.
Helm Hammerhand is no wraith.
Which I know that sounds weird, but in the appendix, which I said I didn't want to use in order to put this movie down, but I'm going to. In the appendix, Helm is called a wraith by the Dunlenders or Dunlendings, and they believe he's eating the bodies or souls of his victims, leading to them fearing him and calling him a wraith. But for some odd reason, the people of Rohan in this movie also call him this and fear him as well. When instead, not listed in the appendix, but you could easily imagine it in your head, they should be hearing the horn of Rohan, which would cause their spirits to rise, not sink, knowing that every time it was blown and time again after that, the enemy was dying at the hands of their king or, a sortie of Rohirrim that ran out to attack him. Instead, everyone thinks he's some ferocious monster that should die or something. I don't know why it was thrown in there. Number 3, it didn't fulfill any of the ideas that they set out to illustrate, such as death, the horror of war, and the impacts of famine in the long winter. This is one of the biggest misses of this movie. If you tell the world that you wish to tell a story about the horror of war, then you must set out to tell the horror of war. I would recommend playing some video games like This War of Mine, or watching some movies in the same vein as like Grave of the Fireflies. And this is to help understand the impact of war on women and children. Then you go watch some footage of animals from World War I or World War II. And then when you have an understanding of that, that's what you show me in a movie. You take those little bits of things that's happened in history or in cinema or in video games, and you translate it. But this movie didn't have any of the horror or death or impacts of famine on the population of Helm's Deep. They just got cold, and that was it. No one really starved to death. They didn't really show the impacts of it. And I would say the reason why is because it didn't really suit the narrative that they wished to tell with Hera. That cutting away from her and showing starving faces and frozen dead bodies didn't fit their story. It was completely fumbled. And they could have told a story with Hera giving away clothes she had in her travel luggage, or breaking furniture and sleeping on the cold floor so her people could sit next to the roaring fire that used to be her bed. This would not only show the impacts of the war as people are freezing to death, but also shows the grace and sacrifice Hera is willing to do for her people. But they didn't, and Hera didn't even sacrifice anything. She refused to marry, which could have secured Rohan an allegiance with Gondor, who could have alleviated the siege of Soothburg or Helm's Deep, or helped Freyalef lead a charge from Dunharrow. But that would take away from her agency, which is something we cannot do. Point 4. Hera becomes invincible by the end of the movie. Without spoiling too much of the movie, the transformation of Hera from using her brain to barely surviving a surprise attack to full-on dueling and killing a man with a shield was one of the quickest ascensions from maiden to warrior I've ever seen. There's a moment in the movie where Hera is surprised in a barn while trying to get her horse by a lord that has betrayed her father. Now, did this guy come with 500 warriors and seize control of the gatehouse to allow Wulf's entry into the city? No. He was there to carry out Wulf's obsession vengeance against Hera for turning him down twice. But Hera, though, is quickly disarmed during the scuffle, and at first she's saved by her horse, but somehow this guy survives a horse's kick and she's able to use a pitchfork to kill him. Which, okay, I like that. And then within 3 minutes, if not less, she's swatting arrows out of the night sky with her brother. Like, what? But that wouldn't be the last moment. Number 5, a refusal to allow male characters to become the hero. And yes, it was a refusal. Helm and Halef had their heroic moments, but their moments ended with their death.
For our people! Helm!
The one I'm mainly talking about, though, is the absolute abuse towards Freyalef. Freyalef Hildenson is supposed to be the future king of Rohan after Helm and his sons die. And they didn't give him a single heroic moment, except maybe when he appears on the horizon wearing Helm Hammerhand's armor.
For Rohan! For Erlingers!
Delivered to him by a great eagle after Hera climbed 500 meters up a mountain's icy cliff. The one thing you can take away from Star Wars and Rings of Power is that. Like, why? But every moment where he could have been the hero was supplanted by Hera doing it for him. The Oliphant attack was first led by Freyalef trying to save his cousin. Before Hera diverted the Oliphant into some forest and had the Watcher in the water kill it. Which, doesn't make a ton of sense since, they live in rivers and lakes under the misty mountains. But then again, neither did the Great Eagles, who are at this time in the Third Age live in the far north of the Misty Mountain Range. But they took this heroic moment away from Freyalef, which I was fine with because Hera didn't defeat the Oliphant, the Watcher did. And she used her brains, not brawn. Then we come over to the kidnapping of Hera by Wulf's lieutenant, general, whatever, which happens right after the Watcher eats the Oliphant. The size proportions in this story are all over the place, because I could have sworn Oliphants were bigger. But Wulf's commander captures Hera and takes her to Isengard. Freyalef and Hildy stake out Isengard before finally making their move to free Hera. So you may be thinking that Freyalef must have led this daring assault into Isengard, which is filled with Dunlanders. all in the pursuit to save his cousin. Well, you would be wrong. Freyalef took some archers out on the walls while his 60-year-old fought against 3 heavily armed men before stealing a horse after jumping off like a 3-story balcony, which is another trope in this movie. Why have men do it when you can have a singular strong female? And, I'm trying not to sound, a little sexist. I mean, some of my favorite movies have strong female characters. Like, Alien. Alien has a strong female lead. Well, I mean, technically, the movie actually followed Dallas before flipping to Ripley in the final 25 minutes. So, Aliens. Aliens has a strong female lead. But then again, I mainly watched it for the Space Marines. I mean, machine guns versus aliens, that's all I've been wanting for like the last however many years it's been. Oh, God. Am I? I might be a little... anyways, yeah. The ending of the movie has another heroic moment stolen from Freyalef, and not just Freyalef, but also the last defenders of Helm's Deep as well. Freyalef arrives on the scene with the last of the Rohirrim, and this is right after Wulf has gotten his siege tower onto the ramparts. Hera appears before Wulf and challenges him to a duel, which she wins. Wulf, in anger, he breaks his vow to Hera and orders his men to charge into Helm's Deep. Now, pop quiz. Who stands at the end of the ramp ready to take the charge of the Dunlenders? Is it A, the men of Rohan and the surviving Rohirrim that fled with Helm? Because now that the enemy is coming up a singular narrow path, which would make an ideal final stand, like they did during like the siege of Jerusalem? Or is it B, a 60-year-old woman by herself? It's the 60-year-old woman, who, by the way, doesn't even get wounded. And where are the men of Rohan? Well, they're throwing oil jars. Where did they get the oil? I don't know. Why didn't they use the oil to keep warm? I don't know. Why didn't they defend the gap? I don't know. And you need to stop asking questions. But they're off throwing jars of oil from like 60, 70 yards away to set fire to the tower, while one elderly woman defends the gap. Just like, what the hell? But this was the moment I realized nobody apparently at WBD will challenge anyone who worked on the original Lord of the Rings, even if what they're doing is stupid. But the thing is, not only did Hera defeat Wulf a second time and kill him, she stopped her cousin from chasing down the enemy army that murdered and pillaged her people. It was just another FU. Like, you don't do that during a war, especially a genocidal one. But that all comes back to the realization of Tolkien's work. Once you realize it's because technically in the appendix the war didn't end until Freyalef stormed Isengard and defeated the last of the Dunlendings, you knew they couldn't have that. And if we showed that, it would have taken away from Hera and made Freyalef look cool. And we can't have that. Also, Freyalef only becomes king because Hera abdicates the throne to him. Just another gut punch for the man that liberated Rohan. But, he got the last laugh. After taking the throne, he and his descendants would use the next 300 years eradicating Hera from their history books. Or at least that's the story they set up with this movie. And that's my review of this movie. The obvious movie is right in front of their faces, but instead they decided to pursue a story that floundered and flopped. Even if you take Tolkien out of it, which is impossible, the movie is mid at best. Personally, I would say a 3 or a 4 out of 10. But once you realize it's Tolkien's work, it's a fat goose egg. The only thing I can say is hopefully that this is the last Middle-earth move. There's going to be a Gollum movie. Oh, God. Wait. Who's writing it?
No. Wait.